So we left off talking about the populists and how they are disappointed by the end of their movement because of the presidential election of 1896, right? But one of the things that I also mentioned is the fact that while the movement is has come to an end, while the party comes to an end, their ideas do not. There are a lot of people, millions of people, who actually are hoping that somebody that a group of people are willing to continue on with this level of momentum. And there is, thankfully, that's where we enter into the progressive era. The first 2 decades of the 20th century are shaped by a reform minded movement. The last 2 decades of the 19th century are the Gilded Age, right? And the populists on their own were trying to fight back against that. And the first 2 decades of this 20th century will really be the result of some of the seeds that the populists plant. And so I want to talk about what those results are. I want to begin, however, with talking about the differences between the populists and the progressives, especially because in the end, the goal is the same. The goal is reform, it's change. Because remember, the Gilded Age is just filled with corruption, especially if you were a part of the working class. You paid a heavy price if you were in the working class. And so the goal is to bring a sense of accountability. Accountability if you were a political leader, accountability if you were a factory owner, a business owner, but also an ability and opportunity for voters to have a greater participation and a greater say in the world around them and the communities around them. So I want to talk about how progressives and populists are different, starting with the movements themselves. Populism, while it began as a social movement, we talked about how the Farmers Alliance was established in 1870 in Texas and then continues on nationally as a cooperative. Once it becomes a political movement, it stays a political movement, right? Once it becomes the People's Party, that's it. The focus is entirely on politics. How do we win political office? How do we focus on legislation? Whereas the progressive era is entirely a socially based reform movement. Now, eventually, progressives will form their own political party, but even then, it's not entirely focused on political reform. So, what happens from beginning to end is there will always be a focus on social reform. And this is also going to be something that affects where they work, right? Because populists, by and large, they're going to focus on national issues, whereas progressives are going to look for issues that they can fix on the local level. And once they do that, they look for issues they can fix at the state level. Once they do that, they look for issues they can fix at the national level. Every victory is a victory. That's how progressives approach it, right? Whereas populists are looking at a presidential victory. It's all or nothing for them. Progressives are very different about their approach. So we're not just looking at changing legislation. We're trying to change business policies. We're trying to change social policies. We're trying to make sure that kids get to go to school. We're trying to make sure that families have better housing, better working conditions. All of that is on the debate table here. The other thing that is different is populists are working class, right? Remember, when the People's Party is established, they make it very clear that they represent the producing classes. So whether you are a farmer in the American West, you are a sharecropper in the South, you are a worker for the steel industry, it does not matter. You can find a place in the People's Party, right? for the progressives, they are largely middle class. And what I mean by middle class, the middle class in the 1900s is very new. This is a very different thing in the American economy, because prior to this, especially in the Gilded Age, there really wasn't there wasn't a middle class. There was the wealthy and there were the working class, and that was it. In the 1900s, you start to see the emergence of a middle class where there are people who aren't wealthy, but they're not struggling paycheck to paycheck, right? And these are people who are usually better educated, so they are college trained. These are going to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, and there's a new field of professionalism called social work. So social workers become really significant. Psychologists are going to be important eventually. And all of these professionals are going to use their training as a part of their reform activism. That's important too. So their background, their economic background, isn't just for status. It also helps them as they focus on different reforms. It helps them come up with strategy. And that leads me to this last point. For populists are going to use personal stories to try to convince people to join the movement. So we're going to talk about farmers who are struggling in Texas, farmers who are trying to overcome, natural disasters while still being able to pay the railroad companies and still not getting by and not being able to afford things and depending on the kindness of strangers and yada yada. Or they're talking about the woes of the factory worker. Whereas progressives are going to research. They're going to use statistics. They're going to use data to talk about why the safety and livelihoods of workers are important to factory owners and why factory owners should pay better. And if they pay better and create better working conditions, how ultimately that is to the benefit of the factory, and that's to the benefit of business. That's going to eventually lead to better profits. In other words, the populists are going to try to draw to your emotion, but progressives are going to give you numbers and say, okay, look, this is how changes in how you conduct business, how you treat your workers, how you change this law will have long-term effects, and those effects will be beneficial to everyone involved. So when we talk about the progressive era, what you'll see is different types of approaches to progressivism. Remember, with populism, it's largely political, right? In progressivism, it happens in different ways, in different approaches, different angles. Different people are getting involved here. So I want to talk about the first group and probably the most prominent. Those are people known as muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists, investigative journalists who exposed corruption at the political and economic levels. So these are people who are looking into government officials, whether they're city officials or, higher up, and they're looking at different factories, different industries, how are they doing business, and essentially writing stories that expose the corruption at those levels. And the goal is to educate or enlighten the American reader and hopefully inspire the American reader to demand change. That's the goal. So what they're doing is investigating and writing about what they find, especially if it's corruption. But the goal is to inspire readers to demand change. I want to give you 4 examples of muckrakers, starting with Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens will publish a book of essays. The book is entitled The Shame of the Cities. You'll notice on the top left-hand corner where it says, "Who are the real enemies of the Republic?" So Lincoln Steffens initially wrote some essays for McClure's magazine, in which he talks about going to different cities in the country, most of them in the Midwest. So he went to St. Louis, Kansas City, I think a couple of places in Illinois, and other areas. And he does a lot of research into local leaders there. When I say local, there are investigations at the city level, but he also looks at government officials. What he finds is the people who are the wealthiest businessmen also tend to be the most powerful. And what he means by that is he finds stories of businessmen who were able to bribe, state legislators, judges, even governors to do their bidding, whether it was a special contract, whether it was a loophole to get them out of serving jail time, all of these different ways that businessmen were not held accountable or businessmen bribed their way into special treatment. That's what he's exposing in each of these essays. And essentially what he's doing is he's showing, listen, corruption is not just at the federal level. It's right here in your own backyard, right? Ida Tarbell is responsible for writing an expose about Standard Oil. We've talked about Standard Oil here. So here at the bottom right hand corner, you can see the great story of Standard Oil. Ida Tarbell also wrote, she started writing articles for McClure's magazine about Standard Oil, which was the company established in 1870 by John D. Rockefeller. Remember, it's established in 1870, but by 1900, Rockefeller and Standard Oil had control of 90% of the oil industry in the United States. So she starts writing these articles and then she realizes, okay, there's a lot more going on here. And what she ends up doing is she writes a 2-volume book, and she entitles it History of the Standard Oil Company. And she basically, from the beginning of the company in 1870 to 1900, she exposes how ruthless Rockefeller really is. I mean, she goes into his background a bit, but then she really digs into how Standard Oil becomes Standard Oil. She talks about the different companies that are bought out. She talks about how they're bought out, and how they become this monopoly with total control over the oil industry. Then there's Ida B. Wells. She's pictured at the top right. She also wrote a series of essays that started out as newspaper articles, entitled, and then those essays were published as a book entitled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. So Ida B. Wells lived in Illinois, and you should know Wells, among other things, she's a writer, but she's also a activist. She's a suffragist. She does all sorts of things. So she travels from Chicago and goes into the South, and she witnesses a lynching and is absolutely horrified by it and cannot believe that this sort of thing is happening. And so what she does is she investigates these lynchings that have been happening in the South and cannot believe that they happen with regularity and they happen at the huge numbers that they happen, right? We talked about that in the previous lecture. One of the things that she also realizes is the fact that Northerners either don't know that it's happening or they're turning a blind eye, right? So the purpose of her writing these essays is to force them to see it, right? It's to make sure that they know that it's happening, and so that no one can say, oh, I had no idea this was going on, right? Then there's probably the most recognizable muckraker and muckraking work, if you can call it that. And that's from Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair went undercover at a meat packing plant in Chicago. And after his experience, he ended up writing a novel. It was supposed to be this huge expose book, a lot like what Stephens, Wells, and Tarbell wrote, except in his version, he decided to fictionalize the name of the company and the name of the individuals that he uses in the book to protect himself. He didn't want to expose what he had done, but he also wanted to protect the individual workers in the factory. So in the meat packing plant, he realizes that some of, if not most of the practices they use to pack meat are, for lack of a better word, disgusting, right? It's horrifying what the American consumer is purchasing and feeding themselves and their families. And the thing is there is no law that says what they can and cannot package to sell to consumers. There is no FDA. There's no Food and Drug Administration. There is no law that says meat has to be refrigerated in such and such temperature. There is no law that says employees have to wash their hands. Nothing like that exists on the books. And so brace yourself. This is one of the excerpts from the book where he describes sausage that had been shipped over from Europe. He says, as you can see, the sausage came all the way from Europe. It had been rejected. So this European countries had rejected this sausage. By the time it gets to this plant, it was moldy and white. But on top of that, the factory essentially drowned this stuff in borax and glycerin. So that's their way of cleaning it up. Dumped it into hoppers and then made it all over again. So they mixed it up and then packaged it so that it could be sold for home consumption. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. There's no law that says they can't do that. There are stories that he tells of meat being on the floor, of, rats, rat feces, insects, all sorts of stuff. And there's nothing on the books that says that they can't do that. But all of these writers are writing these things not to disgust people, but although it does, obviously, it's to anger them enough to push them to demand change, right? That's the point. And that sort of leads me into talking about others who are a part of this progressive movement, but they are actually doing things and they are leaders in doing things. So let's start with these activists, right? The most famous of them possibly is Jane Addams. Jane Addams is a social worker who is responsible for establishing what's known as the Settlement House Movement. Settlement House Movement. So essentially, what she and a couple of other people who work with her are thinking about is how immigrants are adjusting to their new American lives, right? And what she does is in Chicago, she establishes Hull House, Hull. Hull House is built and created in Chicago. Hull House is for women and children, all of them immigrants. If they are married, their husbands live somewhere else. So this is just for women and their children. At Hull House, you are housed in a safe place. So this is not like a tenement building where you're crammed into a space. You do share a room with you and your children. You share a room. However, you have access to regular medical care. You have access to daycare. So while mom goes to work, her children are taken care of, so she doesn't have to worry about what happens to her children. In the evenings, her husband the father can come by and they can spend time together. So there's family time. There are classes available for the children, classes available for the women. These classes teach them American history, civics, English, basically everything that they need to know to adjust to American life. And one of the things that I want you to be mindful of is that there are also opportunities for these people to continue celebrating their own cultural identity. So, for example, in Chicago, because so many people are Polish, if there's a Polish cultural event, a celebration taking place, they are welcome to celebrate that at Hull House, and everybody else who is there is welcome to participate in it as well. So it's not like they're asking people, these immigrants, to forget where they came from or their cultural identity. What they're doing is equipping them with what they need to adjust to an American life, to adapt to an American life, right? To learn the language, to understand what's going on, because eventually, if they want to become citizens, knowing these things will help towards that, right? Hull House is not the be all end all, right? This is not going to be the last place they live. It's just going to be a transitional place. That's the idea. Gifford Pinchot is the perfect example of an environmental activist. Now, Pinchot is also a politician. He at one point had served as a governor somewhere. But what he's really known for is his policies on conservation. He will work very closely with Theodore Roosevelt, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But he and Theodore Roosevelt will pair up and work very closely together to set up our national park system. And the reason why we have the National Park Service is because of Pinchot and Roosevelt's vision for conservation, especially as Roosevelt had had a lot of personal experience going out west. He writes extensively about how nature had helped him to grieve, helped him to heal throughout his travels through the American West. How much it had helped him to grow as a human being. Pinchot echoes that. He feels the exact same way, and he believes that there are sites and places and experiences that the United States holds, especially in the American West, but really across the country, that every American citizen should see at one point or another. So the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite, and every other national park that we have is thanks in part to Pinchot and Roosevelt. So Robert La Follette is a governor of Wisconsin, and he is going to be our first example of a progressive politician. And one of the things that you should know about progressives as politicians is that progressives do not identify themselves with one party or another. You could be a Democrat and be progressive. You can be a Republican and be progressive. Progressive is just how you approach different issues, how you approach different policies, right? So La Follette is a Republican from Wisconsin, and one of his frustrations as governor is that you have these large companies coming into Wisconsin, employing a lot of citizens in Wisconsin, but other than that, not really giving back to the state, right? They're not really paying that much in taxes. And these companies would argue, well, hey, we're employing thousands of your people. So we're providing jobs. That's a huge economic benefit. And even present day, that's an argument you hear. But La Follette says, listen, if you pay higher taxes to the state of Wisconsin, we'll be able to take the revenue from those taxes and we'll be able to build hospitals, build schools, build better and safer parks. And by doing that, you're going to attract more people, more families, and better educated families, families with better incomes. And that is going to improve your property value. It's also going to improve your workforce. So La Follette uses the argument that by investing in the state, you're actually going to reap long term benefits. And listen, La Follette is not the only guy who does this. Cleveland will have a mayor, Tom Johnson, who does the same thing. And Los Angeles will do the same thing. They will convince companies, different industries to invest in their cities, invest in their states, so that there is a long term benefit for both citizens and for these companies, right? And what ends up happening is there is a significant change in the relationship between business and government. The person that I argue truly embodies progressive era politics is Theodore Roosevelt. Nobody embodies it better than him. Theodore Roosevelt is probably best known for serving as the country's 26th president, but Roosevelt has a very long political background. He had served as a state assemblyman for the state of New York. He also served as the chief of police in New York, and some people, there's a theory that the character of Batman is based on him because he liked to go around at night to make sure that his police officers were behaving themselves and not taking drugs and not hooking up with prostitutes. And while he did that, he would wear a cape. That's the story. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I'd like to believe it, though. Roosevelt would also serve as the governor of New York. This guy has a very long, prolific political career, but I think what he's best known for is his approach to politics. And it's a very progressive, it's a progressive minded viewpoint, even before the progressive movement really takes hold. From the moment he becomes a state assemblyman, he very clearly says that his job is to be in service of the people. And that's what he says about every elected office. He says, if you've been elected president of the United States or the city dog catcher, it does not matter. Every elected official has to be in service to the people who elected them, period. And that mindset is going to be really important to how he approaches not just the different roles that he's had leading up to it, but especially the presidency, because he takes this whole thing of Gilded Age era politics and political bosses, all of that very seriously, right? New York is riddled with political bosses, and political bosses hate Theodore Roosevelt because Theodore Roosevelt believes very strongly in the principle of accountability and people abiding by the law. And in fact, he says this over and over and over again. He says, no man is above the law. So one of the things that he is best known for is trust busting. What we mean by that is he goes after unfair monopolies. And here's the thing. There is a law on the books that was passed in the early 1890s. I want to say 1893, but I could be wrong. And it was 1890, excuse me. So in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed. And basically, the Sherman Antitrust Act basically says that unfair monopolies are prohibited. You cannot have a monopoly that corners the market in any industry, whether it's oil, that's, which is what was happening. The sugar industry was problematic. Railroads had been problematic for decades. So the Sherman Antitrust Act says, no, you have to make room for free competition because that is at the heart of a capitalist economy. The problem, though, is that nobody is really enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so these monopolies and the wealthy industrialists behind them are getting away with all sorts of ridiculous, unfair business practices. And this is what Roosevelt cannot stand. So what he decides to do is he decides to go after a guy named J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had, at that point, been the wealthiest man in America and quite possibly the most powerful, second only to Theodore Roosevelt. Although arguably Theodore Roosevelt was second to J.P. Morgan. This name might sound familiar to you, primarily because J.P. Morgan is associated with banking, and still is. So J.P. Morgan, of course, made his millions in banking, and he does it through these really sort of unscrupulous business practices. And eventually he gets into railroads. So he's still in banking, but then he also expands his business into railroads. And he and a couple of other businessmen establish a railroad corporation called Northern Securities. They buy out a few other railroad companies, and Morgan does what he usually does, and that is he puts his people in charge of those railroad companies, and all of these profits go right into his pocket, right? Eventually, Northern Securities controls all of the railroads in the northern half of the country. So Morgan has a huge amount of power when it comes to banking, and now a huge amount of power when it comes to railroads. And Roosevelt says, well, that's not going to work. So he orders the Department of Justice and his Attorney General to go after Northern Securities. And his Attorney General basically says, are you nuts? First of all, nobody is paying attention to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Even when they're brought before any and every court, the lawsuit is dismissed. Nobody's held accountable. Nobody takes Sherman Antitrust seriously. What are you doing? And Roosevelt says, don't worry about it. Let's just see how this goes. Let's just put it out there. What ends up happening is they file a lawsuit against Northern Securities, arguing that this is an unfair monopoly and violation of Sherman Antitrust. And in the meantime, Roosevelt has sent a note to the Supreme Court and to each of the justices, basically saying, follow the law, right? Follow the law. So in a 5-4 ruling, so it's very close, but in a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court rules that, Northern Securities has violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. What's really important here, though, is that Roosevelt went after the big fish. He went after J.P. Morgan, and he does it because he's trying to send a message, right? That he is proudly and openly going after the most powerful, the wealthiest people in America, and he is not afraid. Okay? He is not afraid. I want you to take a look at that cartoon. It's probably one of my favorite political cartoons because it perfectly depicts Roosevelt, who is in the window looking on. He's in his frontiersman outfit. That's what he would always wear going horseback riding when he was out west. And he's got a huge grin on his face. Meanwhile, the guy who is in charge of a lot of his investigations, this is John Cortelyou in the red suit. Keep in mind, the face is accurate, but the body is not. You'll notice that the body is super muscular. Cortelyou is not actually built that way. Okay? The cartoonist is presenting him that way because he wants to show us, the audience, how legally empowered he is. That Roosevelt has empowered Cortelyou to do what he has to do to hold these trusts, these monopolies accountable, because you'll see what he's doing there, right? This guy who has been loaded with money is especially large. And if he wants to squeeze all of this money out of him, it's going to take a lot of muscle. It's going to take a lot of effort. And that's why Cortelyou has the kind of muscles that he's got in this cartoon, right? And you'll notice all of the money that's coming out of this trust is causing a lot of terror for these trusts, but Roosevelt seems extremely proud of it, right? And that's true to the story. Now, the other progressive president, there is another progressive president in between, but that's Taft, and I don't want to talk about Taft. So I'll talk about Woodrow Wilson instead. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat who is a progressive. And what's important here when thinking about or talking about Woodrow Wilson is how he approaches progressive era politics. When he becomes president, it's 1913. And he is, as the 28th president, he is now very post Theodore Roosevelt, and he is not going to be as aggressive as Theodore Roosevelt. So he does not believe in a government that is overly involved. He doesn't believe in a government that should regulate as much as Roosevelt seems to want to regulate, but he does want to make sure that there's room for competition. So he does believe in accountability. He does believe in enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act. He believes in the workers' right to unionize. He believes in encouraging small businesses. So he's very progressive in that way. What he doesn't believe in is, storming into a room and demanding change and reform the way that Theodore Roosevelt does. I think the perfect way to demonstrate this are these two political cartoons here. So on the left is Theodore Roosevelt. Both of them are essentially doing the same thing. It's the same action, but in very different ways, having very different effects. So you'll notice that Theodore Roosevelt is swinging a gigantic bat. And what's important here is usually when you see a baseball bat, the baseball bat is proportional in size to the person holding it. This one is massive, right? So clearly, as big as it is, there's no way that he can truly control it. So when he's swinging it around the way that he's going to swing it around, anybody and everybody's going to get hit. The other thing that I want to point out to you is how big he is. Which is similar to what's happening in this cartoon. Woodrow Wilson is this extra large person here as well, in comparison to all these guys on the ground. So if you were to look at it and compare and imagine this guy representing the railroad trust, this guy would be extremely small in comparison to Roosevelt. So there's going to be a lot of force behind those hits, right? So this guy represents railroads, oil, and then there is the beer trust, and then these guys represent everything in general, right? And the idea is Roosevelt is coming after everything, and he's going to take everything out, come hell or high water. Whereas Wilson is presented in a very different way. You'll notice this is not a bat. This is a stick. Usually it's considered a ruler. And you'll notice that there's a desk here. There are books here. And these are desks, right? And in this context, and here's a globe right here, by the way, if you can't see it, that's a globe. So if you put all of that together, clearly Woodrow Wilson is a teacher, and these big businesses, as you see on their shirts, these big businesses are his students, okay? And he's not swinging a bat the way that Roosevelt is. He's not being careless. He is not going to destroy everyone, but he is going to be very strict, right? He clearly is angry because he's thrown the book on the floor. He is very angry, but he is strategic in who he's going to go after. He's not going after all of these people, but he is going to go after somebody. There is accountability there. And that's important for you to see as well. When we talk about progressive issues and the kinds of things that they focus on, philanthropy is going to be a big deal. Philanthropy is charitable issues, thinking about others. And this is best exemplified by this concept called the social gospel. I need you to think back to the first lecture on the Gilded Age when I talked about social Darwinism. Remember that social Darwinism was the belief that suggested that you are responsible for your lot in life, and whatever happens happens. If you're poor, sucks for you. If you're rich, good for you. You did what you had to do, right? And it completely dismisses your humanity. It completely dismisses your circumstances. The social gospel is the absolute opposite of that. Okay. The social gospel is actually started by, or it's an ideological movement that is created by Christians, by Protestant Christians, many of whom are ministers themselves. And it's based on the gospel. It's based on the words and actions of Jesus. The argument in the social gospel is that Jesus did not just minister to win people's souls, right? The calling or his purpose was certainly to die for people's sins and save their souls. Yes, but while he was here, he also tended to their regular needs, whether that was feeding the thousands of people, performing miracles like healing their bodies, or tending to their regular needs. That was just as important. That was a part of his ministry. And that was necessary so that all of those people could follow him, hear his teachings, and that sort of thing. In the social gospel, what these ministers argue is, how would you be able to save someone's soul if you're not even going to consider that they can't feed their own children? You're going to try to get them, convince them that God loves them and wants them to go to heaven. Meanwhile, they can't afford to keep a roof over their heads, and their children are sick and can't afford medication, and they can't afford regular meals, but you want to save their souls. Social gospel basically says it has to be a lot more than that. You have to connect with their physical needs as well as their spiritual needs. The picture on the left is a part of, or an example of, the works of the social gospel, where you would open things like a soup kitchen, but also have access to a church, and that sort of thing. But a lot of times, it was just a matter of not even having access to a church. It was just about feeding people. It was just about providing clothing to people. The other big progressive cause or progressive issue would be bringing modernization to how people work. By that, I mean, how can we make productivity more efficient? This is best exemplified by Henry Ford. Henry Ford is responsible for creating the assembly line, in which a worker would do the same job every day. It's monotonous, but what it leads to is higher and faster productivity. So you're producing more, but at the same time, the worker is not exposed to or not at higher risk for hurting themselves because they're better equipped for that specific job that they are doing. And so once they do that, they get into a rhythm of how to get that specific task done. The assembly line is going to be the standard even to this day. You can see assembly lines at across the country in different industries. The assembly line is going to be the key to the success of increased production and wartime preparation, especially in World War II. The reason why thousands of planes are built within a couple of months is because of the assembly line. So it's about creating efficiency for the sake of profit and productivity. And I think one of the things that progressives are are going to argue for, and one of the things that I think you have to hold on to here is their argument for economic freedom. So we talked about economic freedom for freed people during Reconstruction. We've talked about economic freedom for workers under the definition from the Knights of Labor, and how they talked about conditions essential to liberty. Now we're going to talk about how the progressives present this. Progressives talk about are the first ones to present the idea of a living wage. Living wage is still used to this day. A living wage is essentially new language that is a decent standard of living. You make enough money where you're not just getting by, but you're getting by comfortably. You can pay your bills and still have enough left in your account for emergencies. You have enough in your account if you want to go shopping or if you want to buy a nice meal, you can, right? That's a living wage. The American standard of living is essentially including that living wage and makes this argument that every American, as long as they are willing to work, every American should have the ability to participate and enjoy the American consumer society. I'm going to say that again. Every American, as long as they are willing to work, should be able to participate and enjoy the American consumer society, right? So now we're talking about economic freedom, but we're tying economic freedom officially to the principles of consumerism. And consumerism, of course, is the idea of just being able to buy stuff, right? So progressives argue, listen, if somebody works, they should be able to make a decent amount of money to where they can support themselves, support their families, and still be able to go to the store and participate in this consumer society. As we are modernizing and as we have access to more stuff, any and every American worker should be able to have access to that stuff. That's the whole idea. So we have now gone from access to land ownership to now access to buying things. Enough money to buy stuff. And that's where we're taking economic freedom. It's going to evolve from there. I just want to make sure that you're tracing this as we go through the course. There are different types of progressivism, but what I mean by that is there are a lot of people who identify themselves as progressives, but there are plenty of progressives who don't identify with these different movements. For example, socialism. Every socialist is progressive, but there are plenty of progressives who will not identify as socialists. I think the best way to explain this is if you look at your hand and you stretch your fingers out in front of you. I'm hoping that you are actually doing this. So if you look at the fingers on your hand. Every digit on your hand is a finger, right? But one is a thumb. You have a pointer finger, you have a middle finger, you have a ring finger, and you have a pinky. The pinky is not the same as the thumb. The pointer is not the same as the middle, right? All of them are fingers, but they all identify as different kinds of fingers. It's the same principle here, right? All socialists are progressives, but not all progressives are socialists. Same sort of thing. Socialism becomes a really big deal in the United States in the early 1900s. The Socialist Party, the American Socialist Party, is established in the United States in 1901, and it calls for immediate reforms. This is a political movement, and calls for immediate reforms, such as free college education for everyone and anyone who desires to go to college. They demand better working conditions. They want public ownership of railroads. That's a big sign of socialism. Public ownership of railroads, public ownership of factories. Again, public ownership of things. That's a big sign of socialism. You will notice this individual pictured here. This guy right here. This is Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs is identified or quickly recognized as the leader of the Socialist Party. He begins as a railroad union leader. He speaks out quite often about equality, political equality, and economic freedom. He becomes very popular very quickly. He travels across the country quite a bit, and people are fascinated by him, and they are drawn to him naturally. And of course, he identifies as a socialist, and so he gains so much popularity so quickly that both Republicans and Democrats think that he is a legitimate threat. Not because of socialism, mind you, but because they believe that this guy could really win office and make a significant impact. Debs will run for office, run for the presidency 3 different times. One of those times he'll run from prison. And even from prison, he wins over 1 million votes. So that goes to show you how popular he is. Socialism in the United States will claim, like in 1912, for example, will claim roughly around 150,000 members. They had newspapers across the country. New York, of course, is seen as the hotbed of socialism, but you should know that in the number of socialists per capita and the number of elected socialists to office, the highest number is actually found in the great state of Oklahoma. There are more Oklahomans, especially among farmers, who identify as socialists than anywhere else in the country. Again, this is per capita, so looking at the percentage of socialists in our population compared to others, yeah, we actually lead the country in identifying with the Socialist Party. A lot of these socialists, while they identify as progressive in their policies and progressive in their beliefs, it's really because they are progressive compared to other people. Socialists get really frustrated with the progressive movement. They get frustrated with how slowly things are changing, how slowly reforms take place. That's really problematic for them. And that's a shared sentiment. They're not the only ones who are going to be frustrated. The other group that's frustrated will be feminists. Feminism in the United States happens we are currently in the 4th phase of feminism. Yeah, the 4th phase of feminism. The first phase of feminism is really concentrated on suffrage, the right to vote for women. And this is a very frustrating process because when you talk about feminism in the United States, there are all sorts of angles here. Do we want to look at workers' rights for women, equal pay for equal work, or equal pay in general? Or are we starting just with the right to vote? How does this work? So, the first phase of feminism is really concentrated on suffrage. The problem here with this first wave is it happens very slowly. Suffrage in the United States happens at a state by state process, and it is happening in the American West. And states like Colorado and, Idaho or Wyoming territory will be among the first to have suffrage. But again, it's very slowly, and suffragists do not agree on a strategy. It takes them a while to get there. Some of them are more radical than others. So when we talk about the progressive movement and progressive varieties, the problem here is that not everybody can agree. That's the whole point of this entire slide, is that not everybody can agree on strategy here, because socialists and some feminists, like Alice Paul, they're going to want a more radical approach to reform. They're going to demand something that's more invasive and in your face. That brings me to labor. So, labor, of course, in the United States continues to be a major issue. And one of the leading voices of labor in the United States, and I don't think I have her name on here, so I'm going to mention it now. But one of the leading names for workers' rights will be a woman named Mary Jones. She's also known as Mother Jones. Mary Mother Jones was an 83-year-old woman who had worked extensively to help unionize workers. At 83 years old, she was actually arrested and put in jail because she was in Colorado trying to organize the United Mine Workers. She was trying to get them to organized to try and start their strike against the mining companies in Colorado. Mining is extremely dangerous, and miners in Colorado were extremely were at risk in the most extreme conditions. So at one point, Mary Jones says that the workers' union had only the Constitution to protect them, whereas the owners had bayonets. In other words, we have the law on our side, but the other guys have weapons. And it turns out that those other guys with the weapons are more powerful. So she's accusing the owners of abusing their power, literally, through weaponry. The reason why this is important is because she's arrested for what she says. She's arrested for accusing these owners of abusing their power and, using violence to their advantage and that sort of thing. And courts at the state level regularly prohibited strikers from speaking, from picketing, from distributing literature during labor disputes. So essentially, what state courts were saying is, if you're going on strike, you don't have any access to your First Amendment rights. And that's what Mary Jones was commenting on. We should have access to our First Amendment rights, but we're being denied those things. So it's in this time period that you get the emergence of the concept of civil liberties. Civil liberties is different from civil rights, so I'm going to differentiate them for you. Civil liberties is a focus specifically on the First Amendment. It is essentially, remember, the First Amendment is about your freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And essentially, civil liberties is basically saying, now, civil liberties, sometimes there's some wiggle room, not often, but it's very much concentrated on this idea of the First Amendment, okay? That no matter what the situation is, you should always have access to your freedom of expression. That is your civil liberty. You should be able to wear the kind of outfits you want to wear. You should be able to express what you believe, what you think freely without the threat of oppression, without the threat of prison time, right? Whereas civil rights is focused on the concept of equal protection under the law from the 14th Amendment, if that helps you to better understand it. Does it always go that way? No, but just for the sake of our discussion here, that's the easiest way to differentiate. Civil liberties is going to focus on the First Amendment. Civil rights focuses on equal protection from the 14th Amendment. Workers' rights during the progressive movement is going to bring attention to the cause of civil liberties and why civil liberties is so, so important. Okay. Immigrants during this time period are going to be at the forefront of labor issues because immigrants are going to organize and go on strike more often than not. These groups of people will organize by the thousands. And when they organized democratically, when different unions came together to organize, they found actually tremendous amount of success. And the one that I want to point out is one called the Uprising of the 20,000. The Uprising of the 20,000 was a strike in New York's garment industry where young women, and these are young women as young as the age of 14, who most of whom were immigrants, had been hired to work in the garment industry, united with male garment workers in another union, all to strike against working conditions, but also for better pay. What it leads to is a compromise. It's not a great compromise, but it's a compromise in better pay. And it draws attention to the fact that immigrants really are the face of workers' rights and the workers' rights movement. However, it's not always effective. And the images that you are seeing now and that I'm about to show you in the next slide are pretty traumatic. So I do want you to brace yourself here. In March of 1911, there is a fire in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. Many of the young women who die in this fire were participants in the Uprising of the 20,000. Now, I know that the headlines say 150 perished. The specific numbers, the exact numbers were 146. Most of them were around the ages of 14 to 18. Many of them, as the headline tells you, actually jumped to their deaths trying to escape the fire. Here's what happened. The factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building. If you can see to the right here on this image. So these are the top 3 floors of the building, the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. And you can see the flames that are shooting out of the windows there. So the fire starts, and here's what you've got to know about the factory. So the factory occupies all 3 floors. When you get onto the floor, there are doors that open into the the factory where there are sewing machines and all of this stuff, the doors were locked from the outside. So the manager, the floor manager, or whoever it was, locked the doors from the outside to prevent any of the workers from leaving. And also, the doors were super narrow to control how many people could leave during lunch break and that sort of thing. Remember, this is during a time period where there are no such thing as fire codes and there are no such things as building codes. So there is no fire escape. There are no laws that say that doors can't be locked from the outside. So these workers, and there aren't just women there and young girls, there are also some men who are working here as well. They are literally trapped on these floors. And what makes this even more horrific is that when the firefighters come, people are thinking, okay, now we've got some help. The firefighters show up and their ladders cannot reach high enough. In fact, I don't think it's this image, but there is a different image that will show you that the highest the ladders can reach is right about here. It cannot reach to where these workers are. And so to escape the flames and to escape the smoke, they start breaking windows, and some of them jump, and many of them jump to their deaths. There are some who survive miraculously, and as you can see in this image on the right, this is a police officer is checking the bodies to see if anyone actually survived. Here you see another police officer carrying a coffin. These are bodies on the ground. There are other photographs of, one that's particularly heartbreaking of a police officer sort of staring up helplessly while there are bodies next to him just watching, because there's really not a whole lot they can do except hope that these young people can survive the fall. This is probably the most heartbreaking image. In a different building, in a larger hall, they opened up the hall and filled the room with coffins of all 146 bodies. And family and friends were asked to come by to try and identify the bodies as best as possible. Some of them were actually identified by elimination, right? Because they couldn't be identified just by looking at them. So it's quite traumatic and horrific. But what happens as a result is immediately the state government of New York will pass laws that require buildings to adopt fire codes. Companies are no longer allowed to lock their employees into their jobs. Workers are free to come and go. Doors have to be a certain width in measurement. So 146 people have to lose their lives, but it results in a dramatic change of worker safety. When we talk about reforms like that, these reforms are going to be pretty significant, right? There are reforms that are going to result in increased power for voters, like the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment leads to the direct election of senators. Before, state legislators would vote on who would be senators from their state. And the 17th Amendment says no, the senators must be directly elected by the voters. In some states, you have the process of initiative or referendum or recall, and some states you have all three. Initiative is when voters introduce a bill to their state legislature for them to vote on. So if you've got to come up with a petition, get enough. If you collect enough signatures, then you can introduce that to the state legislature, and then they'll take it from there. They'll have to debate on it. They'll have to take it to committee. It's a whole long process, but you get the chance to introduce it. We do have initiative here in Oklahoma. We also have referendum. Referendum is when the state legislature decides to let the voters decide on a particular issue. So when it comes to election time and you start to see ads or little billboards that talk about state question 732 or state question 101 or whatever, that's what we're talking about. That's when the state legislature presents a bill to the voters and says, you know what, this is for you guys to decide, and that's what's going to happen. Does it always work out? No. There was one particular bill presented a few years ago about marijuana use. Some level of marijuana use, I think, where the Oklahoma Supreme Court said, no, that's dumb. So, it doesn't always work in the voters' favor, but it's designed to give voters a certain level of power. Then, of course, there's recall. And recall is the voters' opportunity to remove an elected official from office. So it's basically the voters' version of impeachment. Now, it is a very long, drawn out process, just like impeachment is. You'd have to come up with a petition, gather enough signatures, take it to the state legislature. The state legislature has to vote on it, hold a special election. The election question would be, should John Doe be removed from office? And if the majority votes yes, he should be removed, then John Doe is removed from office. And then you've got to have a new election to decide on who's going to replace John Doe. It's a long, drawn-out process, but it is, again, something that voters have an extraordinary amount of power to do. Not every state has it. I should emphasize that. Not every state has it, but the states that do have it, it's again, a long, drawn-out process. Another reform that progressives really focus on is women and child labor reform. As you can see on the left, you can see this ad for child labor to make tent cloth for the government. This ad was actually created in 1861. Child labor had been a huge source of employment for decades. It's not a brand new thing in the United States. Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before, but children as young as the age of 5 or 6 had been hired to do a various amount of jobs, whether it's sell newspapers on the corner or go into a mine, or even work in factories for cotton mills. This is going to be an issue that's really contentious, especially when it comes to the working class, because working class families depend on the income that women and children bring in. Even though women and children are paid significantly less than men, even if they were doing the same jobs, it's still income, right? And what progressives do is they make a couple of different arguments. One, they'll make this super middle class argument that suggests that women should be at home raising their children. It's very, very progressive middle class and very sexist as we would define it now. Defining it then, it seems very normal and gendered, but it's very gendered, right? And the child labor issue is very interesting because progressives are going to say, listen, children need to be in school, not at work. and there were no laws on the books that required children to go to school. So progressives, work really hard to put laws on the books that required children up to the age of 16 to go to school. And if they did not go to school, the parents were punished. So that's kind of a big deal. And meanwhile, farmers and working class people who worked in factories and that sort of thing are really annoyed by this, because this is basically a frustrating point for them, that shows that progressives aren't really connecting with the working class. They don't understand the financial struggles that the working class have. Another really interesting, bizarre, and offensive issue that the progressives take on is eugenics. Eugenics is going to come up in the next lecture, which is why I want to introduce it now. Eugenics is introduced as something that is based on scientific research, and I am saying science heavy on the air quotes, okay? Heavy on the air quotes. This so-called science is based on really stupid things like the shape of people's skulls, the size and shape of people's faces, fingers, hands, their overall body shape, their skeletal structure. It's very sort of not just based on skeletal structure, especially of the skull, but also based on, it's also very racially driven. The idea, though, is that eugenics would help to control the population. And the motivation here is, how do we make sure that people who, quote unquote, shouldn't have kids don't have kids, and those who should have kids have as many kids as possible? Do you see this certificate here on the bottom right-hand corner? This guarantees that I have examined the sender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. That is specifically for white people, to promote population growth and to make sure that only the best and the strongest are reproducing. What happens as a result is there is this heavy promotion of sterilizing, even if it's forced sterilization, of Black women. It will also happen to Indigenous women and other minority women. And they are forced to endure these very painful processes. And it's all in the name of saving humanity and the good of humanity and the good of the human race. It's nonsense, I should add. I cannot emphasize that enough. That for a movement that emphasizes education and advancement and progressive mentalities, this is the most backwards thinking that you could possibly find. But it's their way of trying to, their way of trying to present a very elitist, classist, racist type of thinking. Because I should also emphasize here, a lot of working class people are going to be on the wrong end of this eugenics research too, because they're poor, right? So while they might be physically presentable, mentally they won't be seen as okay. So how does the progressive era come to an end? It comes to an end gradually and as a result of a few factors. So it's not like the populist movement where populists come to an end quite suddenly. The progressives run into a couple of problems. One of them is the biggest problem of them all, and that's World War One. The war puts a gigantic pause in any kind of reform movement. I mean, who's going to be reform minded in the middle of a war? The question becomes, okay, are we going to focus on reforms or are we going to fight for the cause of democracy? We'll talk about fighting for the cause of democracy in the actual lecture about World War One, but you know, what's going to be our priority here? Are we going to fight for women's suffrage or are we going to fight for democracy? Are we going to fight for child labor laws or are we going to fight for democracy? More and more people started to choose democracy. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't think that reform was necessary. It was because it would become an issue of patriotism, right? And loyalty. In addition to that, and I should say in the middle of all that, there's a lot of domestic unrest that's taking place in the United States, particularly in 1919. It will begin as the war begins. In 1914 through 1917, there's a lot of unrest, but it really hits its peak in 1919. So, communists and anarchists are going to be accused of and found guilty of leading strikes, and these strikes are going to be massive. There are strikes across the country from Seattle all the way to New York, in Pittsburgh, and there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of workers who are involved. These strikes become violent, extremely violent. And of course, in every case, rather than look at the working conditions, rather than look at how employers are treating their workers, communists and anarchists are often blamed. Now, to be fair, there are a few occasions where anarchists are rightfully blamed because anarchists will create a coordinated attack in 1919 in which government buildings and government officials are targeted. So 1919 is a really scary year to be an American. That all ties to these levels of unrest. And that points me to that political cartoon that you see on the left there, right? What the cartoonist is trying to suggest is that by being associated with labor, labor starts with strikes and walkouts, but then it leads to disorder, and that leads to being associated with Bolshevism. By Bolshevism, they mean communism. But communism is tied to murders. I don't know if you see that, but yeah, it's not just a political ideology. You're also going to start killing people. And that is what leads to chaos. And from chaos, who knows what happens, right? And finally, there's quite a bit of racial upheaval. 1919 through 1921, there are massive race riots that take place across the country. You see a newspaper article there from Macon, Georgia, of how there are 5 churches that are burnt down. This is typical. There's a massive, issue that takes place in Chicago that we'll talk about, but it all culminates to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. So, in the middle of all of this chaos, how are you going to reform? Who's going to want to reform, right? So, that leaves us with this question. How in the world does the United States find itself in the middle of World War I? That's where we'll pick up in the next lecture.